而在说到未来的经济发展时，大家普遍看到的是中国难以维持过去几十年的2位数高速增长，而印度似乎增长的黄金时期还没有到来，形成了一上一下这样的趋势。印度到底会在华盛顿和北京之间起到怎样的作用呢？不仅仅是华盛顿的态度，也不仅仅是印度的发展轨迹，也有中国到底如何处理自己经济危机的问题。今天呢，我们就要特别在这个今天的思想先驱报中引述来自《纽约时报》的报道，为大家介绍中国现在出现的问题到底是怎样的。其中有一位朱镕基时期的得意门生楼继伟，中国的前财政部长，近期在接受中国媒体财新网采访时的话也被《纽约时报》引述，说现在是什么都遇到了天花板，消费这里是天花板，经济复苏是天花板，房地产也是天花板。整个体制如果是被卡住了、僵住了，就真的是撞到了天花板。那么习近平到底是不是被卡住了？中国的体制还有没有灵活运用的空间？中国能不能像苏杰生口中的印度杂耍人一样，可以把好几个球都在空中抛出，而同时又不让任何一个球落地？习近平到底是僵化之人，还是在危机时刻也可以体现出某一种灵活性？今天稍后在思想先驱报，我会与和平先生进行更多的探讨。以上就是今天我们为大家准备的主要节目的内容。一系列的外交活动今天刚刚开始，未来的几天，特别是到周末 G20 峰会登场，还会有哪一些精彩的瞬间？请大家不要离开今日华尔街和华尔街电视，随时关注我们的报道。感谢甜点，感谢如是我们，感谢 Donald Frank， 感谢 JZ， 感谢云水，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为大家回顾过去24小时的重要新闻评论以及其他精彩内容。
欢迎您收看华尔街电视简报。英国商业和工业联合会警告称，随着利率飙升，英国虚弱的经济将停滞不前。英国每日电讯，英国商会警告称，随着利率上升导致经济长期低迷，英国经济可能会停滞不前。英国商会已经大幅下调了其增长预测，预计今年国内生产总值 GDP 将仅增长 0.4%， 明年增长 0.3%， 2025年增长 0.7%。该商业团体表示，这种持续低经济增长与以往的经济冲击和衰退时期相当，例如上世纪70年代的石油危机和2008年的金融危机。世界最富有人士的100万亿美元之战。经济学人，财富管理正成为金融行业中最具吸引力的业务。随着2007至2009年全球金融危机后的监管措施，使得贷款或交易等资产负债表重的业务变得困难和昂贵，该行业得到了快速发展。相比之下，财富咨询几乎不需要资本，而且规模化的公司可以期望获得约 25% 的利润率。像黑石集团和先锋集团这样的公司管理的资产规模庞大，然而他们每投资$1只能收取一小部分的费用。财富管理师的标准费用是客户资产的 1%， 每年一次。软银的 ARM 在巴尔的摩开始 IPO 路演，以争取 T. Rowe Price 的支持。路透社，由 SoftBank 集团拥有的芯片设计公司 ARM Holdings 已开始其即将到来的首次公开募股 IPO 的营销路演。该公司正在巴尔的摩与潜在投资者会面，包括 T. Rowe Price 和 Sands Capital。预计 ARM 将在接下来的几天内与其他投资者在纽约等城市会面，以准备于9月13日定价其 IPO。ARM 计划通过其 IPO 筹集约49亿美元，估值超过520亿美元，预计将成为今年最大的股票市场上市。红牛符合 F1 预算上限，避免再次超支。英国每日电讯，根据国际汽车联合会 FIA 的消息，所有10支1级方程式车队已确认符合2022赛季的预算上限要求。此前，红牛车队因2021年度轻微超支被判罚款700万美元，并减少了今年的风洞测试时间。尽管受到处罚，红牛车队在2022赛季中占据主导地位，迄今为止赢得了全部14场比赛。今年夏天早些时候有传言称，有几支车队有可能违反预算上限，引发了对审计过程有效性的担忧。中国的新芯片是对几个世纪以来西方知识产权盗窃的报复。彭博社， 中国在发展先进半导体技术方面取得的进展，对美国及其遏制中国技术进步的努力构成了挑战。据报道，华为和中国顶级芯片制造商已经为 Mate 60 Pro 智能手机研发了一款先进的7纳米处理器，该处理器由中国的中芯国际制造。中国政府还筹集了400亿美元来支持本土制造业的发展，这意味着更好、更薄的芯片即将问世。这一发展不仅让苹果感到担忧，因为苹果希望保持对华为的技术优势，而且让拜登政府感到担忧，因为他们希望阻止尖端技术落入中国手中，特别是担心这些技术可能被用于增强北京的军事能力。然而，历史表明，通过商业手段阻止技术秘密的传播是困难的。文章认为，商业力量将不可避免地导致技术知识的传播，无论试图加强制裁制度和保护知识产权。欧盟的雷因德斯表示将接管委员会的竞争领域。路透社 DDI 雷因德斯被指派担任欧洲委员会的竞争事务组，接替现任欧洲投资银行 EIB 主席候选人玛格丽特·维斯塔格。雷因德斯和维斯塔格都来自同一个亲欧洲的政党团体 Renew Europe， 该团体全力支持维斯塔格竞选 EIB 主席。维斯塔格将从欧洲委员会休假，专注于竞选活动。西班牙政府也提出了自己的 EIB 主席候选人及其财政部长纳迪亚·卡尔维诺。维斯塔格计划在明年结束他在欧洲委员会的任期。随着华尔街的动荡， ASX 可能会下跌，澳元暴跌。悉尼先驱晨报周二，美国股市在劳动节假期后回归，面对一个相对平静的一周，略有下跌。标普500指数下跌 0.2%， 道琼斯指数下跌 0.3%， 纳斯达克指数上涨 0.1%。工业股遭受了最大的损失，而科技股则有所上涨。沙特阿拉伯和俄罗斯表示将延长自愿减产政策至年底。原油价格上涨，能源股也随之上涨。投资者现在关注经济报告和美联储继续加息的可能性。美国证券监管机构指控5家投资顾问违反保管规则。路透社，美国证券交易委员会 SEC 指控了5家投资顾问公司未能满足与客户资产安全保管相关的要求。违规行为包括未能进行必要的审计，并未及时向投资者提供审计财务报表。涉及的公司包括 Lloyd George Management HK Ltd、Bluestone Capital Management LLC、The Idea Group、Disruptive Technology Advisors LLC 和 Apex Financial Advisors Inc.。Disruptive Technology 同意支付 22.5 万美元的民事罚款， The Idea Group 同意支付8万美元， Bluestone Capital 同意支付 7.5 万美元， Lloyd George 同意支付5万美元的罚款， Apex 同意支付13万美元。在你的20多岁中蓬勃发展的非传统建议。悉尼先驱晨报，根据 Skilled Smart 创始人 Parady Jane 的说法，20多岁的年轻人需要注意3个关键因素，以为自己未来的成功做好准备。首先，金融教育很重要，因为学校不会教年轻人如何处理金钱。其次，年轻人应该接受舒适区之外的选择，因为他们没有太多的经济责任，而且有更多的时间来从错误中恢复过来。最后，年轻人不应该只是跟随大众，根据朋友的行为来做决定。他们需要明确自己的优先事项，并做出符合个人价值观的决策。寻找 Signature Bank 价值330亿美元的商业地产投资组合的买家。路透社，美国联邦存款保险公司 FDIC 正在寻找购买失败的纽约银行 Signature Bank 价值330亿美元商业房地产贷款组合的买家。该组合的大部分是位于纽约市的多户住宅物业。自 Signature Bank 于3月关闭以来， FDIC 一直在试图出售其部分资产。在商业房地产组合中，约有150亿美元的贷款是以租金稳定或受控住宅为担保的。为了保留现有的经济适用房，以满足低收入人群的需求， FDIC 计划将这些贷款放入合资企业中，并保留多数股权。FDIC 预计将在2023年底前完成任何组合销售。顶级基金经理表示，通过伟大的英国个人储蓄账户奖励储蓄者并促进经济增长。英国每日电讯，麦克 奥谢 Mike O'Shea 是普雷米尔米顿投资公司 Premier Miton Investors 的首席执行官，他呼吁创建一个伟大的英国 ISA 来鼓励储蓄者进行投资，并促进经济增长。根据他的提议，储蓄者将能够在新的 ISA 中投资高达25000英镑，比目前的限额多出5000英镑，而这些资金只能投资于英国股票。这一举措将增加储蓄者投资股票市场的动力，从理论上提高他们的回报，并增加资金流入英国企业。奥谢表示，伟大的英国 ISA 可以确保企业获得所需的资金，鼓励他们在英国发展和上市，估计在5年内可以为上市的英国企业筹集超过2000亿英镑。瑞士银行 UBS 首席执行官坚称，银行在收购瑞士信贷后并不过于庞大。路透社瑞士 UBS 首席执行官塞尔吉奥·埃尔莫蒂表示，该银行在紧急接管瑞士信贷后并不过于庞大。UBS 于6月完成了对瑞士信贷的接管，创造了一个拥有 1.6 万亿美元资产负债表的瑞士银行和财富管理巨头。埃尔莫蒂表示，合并后的银行资产负债表的 20% 相对稳定，并投资于瑞士房地产市场，而该银行拥有超过2000亿美元的吸收亏损资本。他还批评了瑞士信贷，称其商业模式根本不对，已不再可行。伯明翰市警告称，削减预算将一切皆有可能，因为市政府破产。英国独立报，伯明翰市议会宣布自己实际上破产，并警告可能不得不削减服务。由工党管理的议会发布了第114条通知，因为他无法履行其财务责任。他将其财务问题归咎于 7.6 亿英镑的平等工资索赔、连续保守党政府的资金削减以及新 IT 系统的成本。该议会面临着8700万英镑的当前年度财务缺口。他可能被迫关闭图书馆，减少垃圾收集频率或提高市政税。与不平等做斗争，一些保守派重新绘制经济蓝图。纽约时报，越来越多的共和党人认为经济不平等或社会流动性不足是美国的问题，认为可以采取更多措施帮助家庭实现或恢复中产阶级生活。尽管关于不平等的讨论在自由派中最为明显，但根据皮尤研究中心的一项调查，约40%的共和党人或倾向共和党的成年人认为美国存在过多的经济不平等。在年收入不到约4万美元的共和党人中， 63% 的人认为经济体系需要进行重大改变来解决经济不平等问题。一位保守派人士 Sohrab Ahmari 对长期以来的共和党经济思维提出了重要批评。他曾担任《华尔街日报》的社论版撰稿人和《纽约邮报》的观点编辑。他最近出版的一本书《暴政公司：私人权利如何压制美国自由，以及该如何应对》详细阐述了他世界观的转变。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报。网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。
The United States and China are really going at it over trade, have been for some time, probably will for the foreseeable future. What does that mean to you in terms of the global economy and trade, and what does it mean for smaller economies as well?
You know, that's a really interesting question, Andrew. I'd like to kick off with a sort of slightly broader perspective. Let's take the calendar back a few years and think about some of the big events that have been hitting the global economy and markets. We had Brexit. We had the Donald Trump administration with the US-China trade war. A lot of people thought that after Trump left office, we'd see some restoration of normalcy or stability in US-China relations. So far, that hasn't happened. Not only has the Biden administration left the Trump administration's tariffs in place, they've actually gone even further, imposing a ban on the sale of leading-edge semiconductors to China. We've had the COVID crisis. A disease emerging in a wet market in Wuhan is not a consequence of geopolitics, but the response of the world to that pandemic, I think, also told us about how fragmented the world has become. Think about the blame game between Washington and China over the origin of the COVID virus. Think about how China mysteriously hasn't bought up Western vaccines, which it could use to give its population an additional measure of protection. And of course, most recently, we've had Russia's war of aggression, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So all of these events, from Brexit to trade war to COVID to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, had a really, really marked and negative impact on the global economy and on global markets. The intensity of those events is going to fade. It's already fading. But I think the underlying cause, that global economy increasingly divided between different political blocs, I don't think that's going to go away. And so even as hopefully we get past the sort of current top of mind problem of inflation, I think we risk entering a world which is divided on geopolitical lines. And what that means, unfortunately, is a world of lower growth and permanent risk of higher inflation.
Well, let's talk about inflation for a second. Why do you think or don't think it's likely to be higher and more volatile than it already is?
So it's a really interesting question, Andrew. If we dial the clock back to 2003, Ken Rogoff, one of the real giants of international economics, at that time, the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, he said, you know what, we're in a period of low and stable inflation, and that's great. And central banks get a bunch of credit for it. But there's also some big structural forces which are keeping inflation under control. And in particular, he pointed to globalization. Now, why does globalization help keep inflation under control? Well, I think there's two big reasons. The first is that globalization brought tens, hundreds of low-cost workers into the global economy. Workers from China, workers from the former Soviet Union. And that helped keep wage pressure under control. And so it also helped keep inflation under control. The second reason is that globalization allowed companies to set up shop wherever they could operate most efficiently, and hyper-efficient supply chains enabled them to get their goods from low-cost production centers to market pretty cheaply. Now, Rogoff back in 2003 was pretty prescient. He said, this is a positive right now, but let me tell you, if globalization starts spinning into reverse, then these effects are going to start spinning into reverse as well. If globalization spins into reverse, consumers in the West lose access to those goods made by super cheap workers in the emerging world. If globalization spins into reverse, supply chains start to break down. Potentially, we risk losing access to crucial commodities as Europe lost its access to Russian gas as a consequence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and turning off the gas pipelines. And we're already seeing the consequences of that with a period of inflation that we've really not seen since the early 1980s.
Fascinating. I want to bring Kirti in now. Kirti, how does all this relate to the topics we've been discussing on this podcast, on the chip war and on geotech wars in general? Do you see this trend across technologies and industries?
I absolutely share Tom's view on this, Andrew, that I'm concerned that inflation is here to stay higher than and longer than we like. Because this trend of fragmentation, or let's call it reimagining globalization, has begun, and semiconductor chips is, in my view, just the tip of the spear, right? We have understood and recognized in our conversations, and the world has recognized that there has been this extreme concentration of manufacturing of semiconductor chips in certain parts of the world, like the Asia Pacific region, right? Now, this wasn't a problem until recently. You're describing, Tom, these geopolitical tensions became more and more focal point of discussions in the world, because for 40 or 50 years, we have enjoyed this process where different countries in the very intricate, complex value chains of technology have focused on different competitive advantages that they're best at. Now we are concerned that if we have a lot of manufacturing, for example, in Taiwan, what that means if these geopolitical tensions escalate and China and Taiwan enter some kind of a conflict, how do we get access to this really foundational technology? So we are seeing this reversal of, it's a good thing that we are adding resilience in the system, right? It's a good thing that we are adding, for example, more fabrication, manufacturing capacities outside of Taiwan for chips so that we don't have to rely on just one region. But make no mistake that in the process, what we are doing is we are basically substituting economic efficiency for other objectives, right? Call it resiliency, call it national security, call it alternatives, etc. But that basically means that prices are pushed up. And semiconductors is like the foundational technology, right? It's in every single thing that you use. Now scale that up and think about a world where all these different industries are in pockets of fragmentation, right? Like some countries band together, ally together, and the value chain only extends over those countries and not over others. So I think there is sort of this systemic trend that is going to keep inflation higher than and longer than we like. What do you think, Tom?
So I think what we have to do is to distinguish between the cyclical aspect of this and the structural aspect of this. So if we think about the inflation that we're suffering right now, part of that is a result of geopolitics. Part of it is because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all that meant for energy prices. And part of it is domestic. It's the response of workers who see higher prices and demand higher wages. And then with those higher wages, boost demand and start bidding up prices again. Now, on that cyclical aspect, we see inflation coming down pretty quickly from the very, very high levels we saw at the end of 2022. At their peaks in 2022, we had CPI readings in the US of 9%, in the UK and Euro area touching, I think, 10%. That's going to come down. And we think that by the time we get to the end of the year, inflation isn't quite going to be back where central banks want it to be, but still, it will be substantially lower than it was a year ago, probably in the 3-4% range. Now, what you're talking about, Kirti, and where I agree with you, is the structural risk of higher inflation, right? And that structural risk of higher inflation comes from that fragmentation of global supply chains, fragmentation of the global labor market. That's a longer term trend. Where's it going to show up in terms of the CPI numbers? Is it 0.5% on the CPI or 1% on the CPI? Or do central banks say, no, this is unacceptable and we're going to crush this inflation even at the expense of lower growth? I think that's a question that we're still going to be grappling with in the months and years ahead.
And let me add another structural issue that I think keeps inflation up and high is demographics, right? You just talked about demographic divide or fragmentation, but there's also just the fact that the world is aging. And there are many big economies like the US, EU, and China, where the number of working age people divided by non-working people is reducing. So, we used to have, as an example, Andrew, 4 working persons per non-working person in the United States, right around before the pandemic. Now we are down to 3.2. And in the next 10, 15 years, we expect that number to be somewhere in the 2s, in the early 2s. So to me, that's another indicator of the structural move to a world where we live with higher inflation.
Tom, I have to ask, and I know this is maybe an oversimplification, but is this fragmentation that we're talking about here to stay?
So that's a really interesting question. And I don't have a crystal ball on geopolitics. I can certainly imagine a world where the United States says we benefit from global engagement, and we have gone too far in terms of kind of politicizing supply chains. We need to have a sort of a new and stable normal in our relationships with China. Perhaps we even saw a little bit of a hint of that in recent remarks from Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary. I can also imagine a world where the Chinese leadership say, you know what? We've also taken this too far. Our wolf warrior diplomacy, our aggressive attempts to seize control of the crucial technologies for the global economy in the future. Our Belt and Road Initiative, they have created global hostility, which is now costing us a lot. We're losing out in terms of access to markets. We're losing out in access to technology. So I can imagine a world where those kind of constructive voices prevail. And I don't think we go back to the kind of go-go years of US-China integration, the kind of period that we sort of saw under, I guess, George Bush Jr. and President Obama. But we have the restoration of something that looks like normal, stable, constructive relationships. I find it difficult to make that the base case, though. Sitting here in Washington, D.C., I just hear a lot of concern about the rise of China. I think China's catch up to the United States in terms of economic size, in terms of technological capabilities, at the same time as China has remained a kind of unrepentantly state-oriented economy and a single-party political system has really kind of fired the imagination of US politicians. And I don't actually see a tilt back to stable and balanced relations coming anytime soon.
You know, it's interesting. China is always trying to brand their aggressions, Belt and Road, Wolf Warriors, that kind of stuff. We in the United States, we're just a bunch of cowboys. We're a cowboy nation, and we're loud and we bust into every room. And our politics right now, the only thing people can agree on a bipartisan level is we don't really like China that much.
If you're concerned about a world increasingly fragmented along political lines, the fact that the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is that they don't like China is another alarm signal.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, you know, you've written that in the long term, a rollback of globalization to late 1990s levels would leave the world 3.5% poorer than if trade stabilized as its current share of output, and 15% poorer relative to a scenario of global ties strengthening. So isn't the answer here obvious? We've got to strengthen ties so we can all prosper?
So I think if we were having this discussion in, let's say, 2001, when the US had just agreed that China could join the World Trade Organization, and you asked someone in DC, should we make the global economy bigger? The answer would be an unequivocal yes. I think if you ask that same question today, the answer would be, well, is the US getting more of the pie or is China getting more of the pie, right? So when China was small and technologically backward and had yet to kind of flex its geopolitical muscles, everyone was happy to see China grow, right? And everyone was happy to see that add to global GDP. And everyone was happy to see that add to profits for all the US companies that have engaged in China in one way or another. Now, China has almost caught up to the US in terms of its level of GDP, has almost caught up in some technologies, rapidly catching up in others, maybe even has the edge in some areas. There's much more concern about the relative gain, right? If the world's getting bigger, I guess that's good. But if most of the gains are going to China and a smaller share of the gains are going to the United States, well, that's going to ring kind of geopolitical, strategic alarm bells here in DC.
Kirti, I want to ask for your thoughts.
So, I was wondering, Andrew, this is really a conflict between, like you said, Tom, two superpowers or an emerging superpower and one, or you could say between liberal democracies and systems that are more authoritarian, right? The number of liberal democracies in the world are reducing. We know that. And their proportion or their share of the global GDP that they contribute to the global economy is also reducing. We know that, right? Where does that leave us? How do we make sure that we don't burn the whole global economy down as we try to worry about the relative gains?
How concerned are you both about the global economy, and what would your proposals be to try to contain the underlying forces of deglobalization or limit economic damage?
So I think there's a risk here, both in China and the United States, that we have an echo chamber of hostility and negativity. And I think that's partly because there just aren't a lot of conversations taking place between Beijing and DC or New York and Shanghai right now. There aren't a lot of people flying back and forth. There aren't a lot of academic exchanges. I don't think there's a lot of diplomatic conversations taking place. And if the default view in DC is that China is bad and people in DC are only speaking to other people in DC, and the default view in Beijing is that America's bad and people in Beijing are only speaking to people in Beijing, well, the risk is that those narratives get amplified and we end up in a much worse place than we need to be. So my first suggestion is a bit more talking, right? It's pretty straightforward. Let's restart the dialogue, which was kind of accidentally closed because of COVID and doesn't seem to have really restarted in a meaningful way yet. My second suggestion is there's this sort of phrase that you hear a lot in US-China relations, which is something like a high wall around a small area, right? Let's define the strategically important stuff, whether it's leading edge semiconductors or whatever, or access to military technology, and let's put a really high wall around that so it's not shared with people we don't want to share it with, but let's allow all of the non-strategically significant stuff to continue on its normal course, right? Let's continue to have trade and investment and research and development and investment relationships and on everything outside of that wall. So to me, that's an appealing idea. The difficulty so far is that no one has defined what that small area which has to have the high wall around it is, right?
Such an important
point. I think we need some thought on both sides to defining what that strategically significant area is. And in the absence of that sort of delimiting of the strategically significant area, the risk is that it just creeps wider and wider and wider and wider. And in the end, we discover we've built a high wall around our entire economy.
You know, that's such an important point. And my colleague, Scott Kennedy, is one of the few scholars in DC at any think tank who has actually gone to China over the last several years and spent significant time there. And he came to a lot of the same conclusions that you're just presenting here. We have to kind of find dialogue, common ground, and figure out what that strategic discussion should be about. Kirti, I'd love your thoughts on this as well.
Yes. This is the, high wall fenced in approach. I think, Andrew, you mentioned that we agree in Washington that we don't like China. Well, we have, although seen, as you know, some proposals on the trade side, better than I, and, export controls. That's where this plays out, in the front lines. Sometimes we have seen these entity listings of Chinese companies that American companies cannot do business with, or certain kinds of export controls that try to put that strategic wall around the most strategic technologies, but they tend to go too far too fast. And we have to caution against that. Let's use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer approach, even in those critical technologies, because we aren't yet ready. We aren't yet ready to create this disruption of the trade, of the technology, and come out the winner on the other end. The damage, and I would love to hear some numbers from you, Tom, on models that you have run, the damage that we would do from economic disruption of the current trade flows is high. But let me make it very specific for my industry, for semiconductors, for example, right? Of all the retail trade sales that originate from the United States, 35% end in China, but 75% pass through China and are sold in the rest of the world. So chips are sold into China and then assembled into different products, and then they're sold out. That's a pretty mega size of trade, and we have to have an alternative answer that builds up slowly over time. We cannot disrupt the supply chain immediately.
If I can ask both of you in closing for your main takeaways for our audience, I'd like to hear them. Tom, you first, and then Kirti, you can bring us home.
There are a bunch of alarming things going on, right? We talked about Brexit. We talked about US-China trade wars. We talked about semiconductor bans. Of course, we talked about the horror of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And yet, if we look at trade as a share of global GDP, pretty stable. If we look at China's exports, still going up. If we look at Qualcomm's share price, Qualcomm, a leader in the semiconductor space, if any company is vulnerable to this, perhaps it's Qualcomm. And yet, since 2016, when Donald Trump came into power and told us we'd be tired of winning against China, Qualcomm's share prices has almost doubled, right? I'm really concerned about all of this stuff. And Andrew, you were kind enough to mention the work we've done at Bloomberg Economics, where we modeled the cost of a Cold War and put that at a kind of astronomical 3.5% of global GDP, trillions and trillions of dollars. I think it's important to keep in mind as we have these discussions and think about these real risks, that the worst hasn't yet happened, right? The risks are there. They're already starting to have a negative impact for some specific companies and for some specific sectors. But if we look at the aggregate trade numbers, if we look at investor views on companies like Qualcomm, I think we have to conclude that the worst hasn't yet happened. And what that means, there's still space for the constructive discussions to try and prevent it from happening.
Kirti?
The worst hasn't happened, and let's keep it that way. There is room for constructive discussions, and that is absolutely the right approach. We define a very strategic fence. We contain as much we can contain, but we also play the timeline that is advantageous to all the players. In other words, don't rush this and be ready.